All right, we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Corsandi, and I'm the Executive Director of Landmark West. We're a 35-year-old grassroots advocacy nonprofit serving the Upper West Side. I'm excited to welcome you to our event tonight, Richard Lippold and Orpheus and Apollo. We wish you could be there with you in person, but this is the best we have, and we're grateful to have this platform tonight at this critical time. By now, you will notice you've been muted and your video is off. This doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We have an amazing assembly of talent to share with you this evening. And after introductions, we will begin with a panel of those who knew Richard Lippold, whether that was to have represented him, worked with him, learned from him, or written about him. For this, we have my co-host, Caroline Zaleski, Joseph Giovannini, Miani Johnson, Marilyn Karp, and Phyllis Lambert. This discussion will be followed by a slide presentation by Maren R. Sullivan. She's an art historian and a curator, followed by a statement by Anthony Wood before we open it to you. We ask that you hold your questions, but before we get too far, take a moment and scroll to the bottom of your screen. You'll find an icon to raise your hand. Towards the end of the program, you can join us by raising your hand and we will respond to as many of you as time will allow. Tonight is the result of many efforts, but it's only possible thanks to our partnership with the Preservation League of New York State and a wonderful program they manage called the 7 to Save. They were kind enough to recognize our need on the Upper West Side and respond to our application, significantly broadening our reach. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Caroline Zaleski, who's not only an Upper West Side resident for 40 years, but holds a master's degree in architectural preservation from Columbia. Her survey with Preservation Long Island led to her book, Long Island Modernism, 1930 to 1980. An ardent advocate of 20th century modernism, Caroline is the chair of the Preservation League of New York State's 7 to Save Endangered Sites program. Please welcome Caroline Zaleski.
Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline. Well, I think I'm just going to tell you, whoops, we've gone to a slide, but just bear with us. The slide presentation is not a PowerPoint, and it's a little funky because Sean has to pop them up as we speak. But I'm going to tell you quickly about the Preservation League of New York State, for those of you who don't know about it. It's the only statewide not-for-profit organization working to protect New York's historic buildings and sites. So do go to our website. There's absolutely hardly any time here for you to learn about our programs, but if you go to our website, you can. And our programs range from advocacy, technical assistance, education, grant giving, awards and loans, and much more. So also become a member. If you become a member, you can join with us and you can learn more about our programs and hear about what's going on. So the 7 to Save program, interestingly enough, was founded by Tony Wood 20 years ago, and Tony Wood is our last speaker tonight. And he was chair of the Preservation League board back then, and he crafted the program. And a committee of board members chooses the 7 sites every 2 years from applications from around the state. And a selection is important to an applicant. And congratulations to those of you, those who applied, who are on the 7 to Save this year. And a selection is really important because it helps an effort, it helps an organization build support for a cause, and it also bolsters visibility for that cause. And then the staff at the Preservation League of New York State are very able and equipped to help the applicant make connections to our programs. So the 7 to Save is highly effective, and many buildings and sites around New York State that we take for granted today are there and indeed saved and useful today because of this program. So here's a slide with the 7 selections, and I'm quickly going to read them off. And the first is the Elmhurst African American Burial Ground in Queens County. The second is the Hudson Athens Lighthouse along the Hudson River in Greene County. The third is the Central Technical High School in Syracuse, Onondaga County. And then we have fourth, Sag Harbor Hills as a Rest and Nineveh subdivisions known as SANS, an African-American, mostly African-American community in Sag Harbor on Long Island. Then we have the entire New York State barge canal system. Then, as you can see, there's a photograph of Orpheus and Apollo, our subject tonight. And it was, and it hopefully gets back up at Lincoln Center's David Geffen Hall. And then last, we have a building on the Finger Lakes, Parrot Hall, is actually on Lake Canandaigua, Geneva, Orange County, upstate. So next slide. And here's a map of the 7 to Save Reach. So this year our sites are in Buffalo, and then they range all the way down to 3 sites actually in, well, 1 in New York, Orpheus and Apollo, and 2 on Long Island. So take it away, Sean.
Thank you, Caroline. As you mentioned, the issue that brings us together tonight is our collective interest in seeing the reinstallation of Richard Lippold's site-specific para-architectural construction, Orpheus and Apollo, in the main lobby of the Philharmonic Hall at Lincoln Center. Conceived in tandem with the design and construction of the hall, this assembly is in fact part of the plaza front and was the first piece of art not acquired but directly commissioned for this Acropolis of the arts. While none of the Lincoln Center campus is a New York City landmark, the entire campus is a National Register eligible site. Orpheus and Apollo was removed in violation of a 2006 letter of resolution signed by Lincoln Center, committing to notify the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, which stated that the center would notify parks, quote, in writing prior to undertaking any major structural changes or alterations to structures or settings that would materially affect the publicly visible interior or exterior materials of Lincoln Center. The 2014 removal was unannounced, and its created existence in New Jersey was excused at the time as temporary. With a larger renovation plan and several permits pulled with fees paid to the Department of Buildings as recently as yesterday, we have concerns. Lincoln Center has assembled a stellar team with Diamond Schmidt and Todd Williams Billy Chen architects who will make interventions to correct acoustics and improve visitor experience, which we largely support. But unfortunately, administration opted to pursue a plan that would preclude the return of the Lippold. Integrating the work of artists was a means by which modern architects provided ornament, and the Lippold is the Philharmonic's contribution to the ensemble of Lincoln Center. While the scaffolding rises, it's not too late for Lincoln Center to respect their art and commit to reinstating this significant piece. Speaking further to this is Marilyn Karp. Marilyn is a sculptor with a doctorate in physics and aesthetics and has taught art and material culture at NYU for 42 years. She is the president of the Anonymous Arts Recovery Society, a board member of the Preservation League of New York State. She could not make our event in person, but submitted a brief statement, which we will share with you now.
My name is Marilyn Gelfman Karp. In 1958, when I was a 19-year-old student at Hunter College, I agreed to assist Richard Lippold in the installation of his sculpture in the grill room of the Four Seasons restaurant in the newly erected Mies van der Rohe, Philip Johnson Seagram building. Richard's works were always bound to their physical space. This building was to be dedicated to the architectural integration and exhibition of bespoke art, the best of its time. The Tricorn, Picasso's theatrical backdrop for the Ballet Russe, occupied the space between the grill room and the fountain room, for which Mark Rothko had been commissioned to paint 4 large paintings. The completion of numerous art installations kept a pace with our installation of Richard's bronze rod and stainless steel wire sculpture. I was his assistant for most of his New York City commissions. In 1989, the restaurant's interior was landmarked by New York City Landmark Commission. This was quite a different story from the installation of Richard Lippold's Orpheus and Apollo at Lincoln Center, then Avery Fisher Philharmonic Hall, with which I also assisted. In October 1963, Calvin Tompkins wrote a complete profile on the installation of this work in the New Yorker magazine as we were installing it. The fraught interior construction of the building, racing for completion deadlines, was going on at the same time as we were working 50 feet above to install. The Structural Bridge and Ornamental Ironworkers Union was pressuring to do the installation, and after fierce negotiations, we prevailed and were made honorary members of the union. I was given a Brother Maryland label for my hard hat. We all made our deadlines by working round the clock. When Philharmonic Hall opened, the main lobby was defined by rich, satiny Muntz metal sheets of brass alloy and glistening stainless steel cable. Orpheus and Apollo were perfectly balanced in symbiotic relationship with the architecture, as wedded as the sculptures of Chartres Cathedral are to that building. The sculpture elevated and fulfilled the interior architecture. It made the space tangible, coherent, and vibrant. It enabled singular human engagement with this space. What would the cultural loss be to succeeding generations of Chartres Cathedral visitors without its sculptures? The loss of Orpheus and Apollo would be a comparable loss. Whether or not the work should be reinstalled is not the question. Whether or not it can be reinstalled is the question. Because Richard Lippold's works are always part of the architecture, supported by it and wholly dependent on it. They do not have form without the building. Right now, this sculpture is just a bunch of metal plates and cables. How has it been stored? Were parts numbered and carefully wrapped? Was a video made while taking it down? As the last man standing, who was there and installed the work, Richard died in 2002, I will say that reinstallation depends upon whether or not the work was responsibly disassembled. Was some record made of the process of disassembly? Did the Lincoln Center archive or the architects retain the blueprints from which we installed? After the model was shown to the architects, Harrison and Abramovitz, it was exhibited at the Willard Gallery to unanimous acclamation. Gene Lippman purchased the model. If all else fails, locating the model could be a start. Every effort should be made to save this work.
Caroline?
This is a slide, this picture is of the house designed by Hermann Herrie, who was a Berlin architect who came to America in the late 30s. And he designed this house for Alma Morgenthau. And by 1952, she had died. And Richard Lippold and his wife, Louise Gruel, I hope I pronounced her name correctly, moved into this house with their 3 children. And Richard Lippold lived here until he died in 2002. And he and his wife separated, and he kept the house, and she left with the children, and he lived there for, I'm not exactly sure, with his partner Gianni Morcelli for about 20 years until his death. And his studio from 1952 until his death was that in that volume. Do you see on the left? There's an entrance door. Well, his studio was in there, and that is where he designed and built many of his sculptures, I should call them. And anyway, I visited the house several times because when I was doing my book, Long Island Modernism, I decided to write about the architect Hermann Herrie. So I went there about 2000, 2001, both years, and had many visits with Richard Lippold and Gianni, and I liked him enormously. And it struck me at the time that I was getting to know an artist who was immensely famous mid-20th century, and that his reputation, his name and his reputation had basically fallen off the map by the time I was there in 2001 and 2. So anyway, the next slide, please. I should say that when I said he was a key figure in 20th century art and architecture, that's because he had a great presence in museums, concert halls, and of course, here in New York City at the Four Seasons Restaurant Grill Room, now a New York City landmark, the GM building, which is adjacent to Grand Central Station, and of course, the work at Philharmonic Hall, now named Geffen Hall, Lincoln Center, where Orpheus and Apollo were installed in 1962. And this shows a photograph of Marion Willard. And Marion Willard was Richard Lippold's dealer. And I got to know her daughter, who's speaking tonight, Miani Johnson, because I also wrote about the house that her mother asked José Luis Sert to design for her on the sort of walls of a very damaged ice house. And here you have Marion Willard with Miani as a little girl. And Marion Willard started her gallery in 1937, and she'd come back from Paris. And in Paris, she met Le Corbusier, she met Léger, she met Calder, she met many artists and key people in art and architectural life. And her great friend was Siegfried Gideon's wife, Carola. So anyway, she represented Richard Lippold. And Miani, please tell us, and Miani, you come in next. You knew Richard well as a neighbor because his house that you saw the photograph of earlier was very near her parents' house, which Miani now owns, and which was designed by José Luis Sert. And they were in a neighborhood together. So Miani not only knew Richard as a person, as a man, knew his family, but she also knows his career very well. So Miani, can you tell us why today we should consider his career important? And what do you think your mother saw so that she basically discovered Richard Lippold and put him on the art and architecture map to become so very well known with these enormously important commissions worldwide?
Well, I realized for starters that I guess I'm about one or so, 1.5 in that picture. Richard would have been, when he moved to Long Island, it was 1955, so I was 7. So I guess I knew him for a long, long time. And he, as far as I know, met my mother through Dr. William Valentiner, who was at the time a very well-respected director at the Detroit Institute of Art. He had been in Europe before, but he was, I think, at the Detroit Art Institute for about 20 years. And I think Valentiner, knowing my mother, had a very strong interest in Paul Klee, whom she had visited in Bern way back when Carola Gideon lured her to come to Switzerland, where they were living at the time. And so he, knowing her interest in Klee, realized that Richard was also interested in Paul Klee, and put the two of them together. Richard would have known him because he was obviously from the Midwest. He went to school in Chicago. They would have overlapped in Detroit in some way. And the Willard Gallery had 8 exhibitions of, do you want me to go into this now, or did you have other questions first?
We have to be quite quick about it.
Okay.
But,
Well,
yeah.
there were 8 shows between 1947 and 73. He also did about 20 commissioned works between 1950 and 1988. I think we sold the work to 13 different museums. He was in all the private collections of the moment, like Nelson Rockefeller, Philippe de Rothschild, etc. And he was a very cool cat in his time. You know, he was at the center of the art world in many, many ways.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember seeing the installations that were at the Museum of Modern Art and at the Met?
I remember seeing, it was called Full Moon, the one at the Modern. It was in a little, it was, had its own niche, if you will, that they built for it. And it was in that same place for years and years and years. And then I guess they did a reinstall at some point. I don't know. Maybe when they redid the building. The piece at the Met was in its own room with, I believe, some Turkish rugs.
Yes, it was in the big room that had rugs. It was basically the Muslim part rooms at the Met, where there were Turkish rugs and rugs from all over the Arab world. So it was there, and it was there for many, many years. And there was a big debate when the architecture changed, what to do with it. And that piece also ended up at the Space Museum in Washington, D.C. for many, many years. Yes, so maybe now's a good time to bring Phyllis in, and then you can talk among yourselves. So Phyllis really, for most of us, doesn't need an introduction, and I mean Phyllis Lambert. She's founding director of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and as an architect, preservationist, scholar of architecture, she's had a profound effect on architecture worldwide. Her book, Building Seagrams, is about the Seagram building. And it's designed with commissioned by her father, Samuel Bronfman, and of course designed by Mies van Roo at Phyllis Lambert's insistence. In this book, Building Seagrams, she beautifully chronicles Richard Lippold's bronze pendentive sculptures attached into the ceilings at the Seagrams building's adjacent Four Seasons restaurant, the grill room. So Phyllis, you had an important and very influential role, and you worked hard on saving those sculptures at the grill room, which were eventually included as architectural elements in the New York City Landmark Designation report for the building and the restaurant. That was a huge triumph at the time to get interior architecture features landmarked. I'm going to read a bit from an email you sent when you wrote back to saying yes to joining us today, and then we'll let you speak. Great, about reintroducing Lippold to the world. He was an incredible artist and great, where is that? It's number 5. And draftsman, sorry about that. An artist sensitive to the creative environment that he worked with. So please, Phyllis, tell us more about Richard Lippold and his working methods and why today we should really call for the return of the sculpture at Lincoln at Philharmonic Hall. David.
Well, it's a very interesting story in terms of the work being at Seagram and why his concept of it. Philip and I asked him. Philip was, of course, the architect of the interior of the Four Seasons restaurant, which is part of the Seagram building, part of the base of it. And so we worked with Richard, and actually it was very interesting. Philip was doing the restaurant in 47? No, 57. And he hadn't even got Richard started working on it without even a contract, and which was done in 58. And he wrote, I chose as material and form the digestions of great suspended mullions on the outside of the building, the perfect section of these mullions in their verticality, emphasizing the building of the building, surging into the space. It is what I reduced to human scale in the sculpture which now inhabits the space. And I watched Richard. You know, it's composed of you've seen in sort of groupings of these wonderful rods. They were made of bronze. They were 1/4 inch in section, and they were from either 1 foot or feet long, and the pattern of the pattern of hanging it, he had two a stainless steel wire that hung up, and there was a wonderful description of him that he hung it in himself, and there were 1,500 pieces, lots of work to do, and he went up on the scaffolding. There was a photograph of him I saw it just recently, and he would adjust it, put it up, then he'd get down, comb his hair, then he would get up on the scaffold again, and he would adjust it, come down, comb his hair. It must have been a lot of hair combing, but it was a very lovely and very completely unpretentious, completely unpretentious. He was just a guy in a way, but one who thought wonderfully and who had sort of marvelous concepts. And he wanted this building to be, part of he wanted his sculpture to be part of the building. There were two pieces actually. The room is square and his sculpture is square in plan. And then because it's in the east, well, anyway, one corner of the room of the grill room, and then he balanced it with another piece, which is like in a way a bas relief hanging on the wall. These wonderful wooden walls that Philip had designed. And one thing that's also extremely interesting is that Philip was very much involved with lighting, and this came from a man who worked with him very much, who had been at Yale and was learning about architecture because he realized that glass architecture was hard to light. And he went to the theater school there. And so this whole theatrical idea of lighting, you wash the walls and then you have spots and then you have twinkle. And Richard loved this, and he said, that his works would simmer with the light. But then he suggested that the curtains for those long, tall windows, 20 feet high, I think, should be out of chains, out of metal. And so then Philip, but he said, because as they move, their sparkle will connect with mine. So this was amazing. And then I want to get to the part, though, of the landmarking. Seagram, the work belonged to Seagram. The Four Seasons restaurant was paid for by Seagram, and they didn't want to have. Philip chose with me the sculpture, the other artworks, but at the same time they didn't know how the restaurant was going to turn out, and they didn't want to have the restaurant own those pieces. So that when it was going to be landmarked, those pieces were owned by Seagram. And so there was a whole complication about that. And Seagram finally, said, okay, fine, they're part of the building. And the big question were they part of the building or not? Could they be moved or not? And of course they couldn't. They wouldn't be anywhere else. They wouldn't have any meaning, and they really couldn't be moved. So I think that is a very important question with regard to Apollo and can't hear you.
Phyllis? Sorry. Yes, Phyllis. I'm going to now go over to Joseph Giovannini. When you, Phyllis, were talking about the sculpture at the grill room, I kept thinking about the piece's kinetic quality, and when you talked about the curtains as well. And Joseph, I'd like you to talk about the quality of Richard Lippold's work, and but let me first introduce you, and why you, Joseph, think it's important today, and why it's important for us to call for the return of Orpheus and Apollo at Geffen Hall. So Joseph is an architect, and he's over there in the last window, sitting in his office, and he's a writer and critic. And in a recent article in the New York Times, he basically calls for the return of the Noguchi designed elements at 666 Park Avenue. And so we invited him today because not only does he know about mid-20th century art and architecture, but he does sometimes call for preservation. So Joseph, tell us why you think Richard Lippold's work is important, and please describe it somehow aesthetically as you do so well for the audience.
Well, thank you, Caroline. I think that you allow me to step into the piece through the Noguchi because the threat to Noguchi represents a threat to that whole class of art installations that was done in the 50s and 60s at a particularly vulnerable time because it's just getting sort of historic, but it's not quite historic. And the buildings in which they're located are frequently subject to the vicissitudes of the real estate market. And so, so I think that the Noguchi represents the same plight that the Lippold represents. It's called Orpheus and Apollo, but there's another classical reference that I think is pertinent because when Lippold went into a space, he was like a cat sensing the space. Were open. He just needed to understand the space because he was not just doing a sculpture in a space in a room. He was doing a sculpture that was integral to the space, part of the space. And so when and there with Lincoln Center is very interesting because rather than doing a kind of a dominantly orthogonal piece, he did really a just falling from the sky. He had been taking a walk, and the New Yorker article is quite interesting about the genesis of the idea, and it comes out of nature. And so rather than calling it the Apollo and Orpheus, you could also call it and Dionysius, because Dionysus, who's the god of wine and debauchery and all these wild things that we repress normally in our nature, is in fact part of our nature. And what he was basically saying is intuitive rather than conscious, although he was very intellectual as well, is that he was saying that part of human nature, part of the architectural nature of this complex should be Apollonian, Dionysian, both. It should have these spontaneous instincts, this what we would now call nonlinear geometries, but at that point was just simply called nature. It could be clouds or waves of oceans, etc. So he was well in advance of his time. He was doing this stuff before the computer made this kind of geometry accessible. So a lot of, from my architectural world, a lot of people are designing this stuff on the computer in three-dimensional programming, whereas he did it, just with his hands and conceptually walking outside, looking at the leaves. What I find particularly beautiful about it is that in this cascade of leaves, it ripples, it shimmers, he really captures a very ephemeral aspect that you might call, mystery or magic. Whenever some artist talks about the magic of a piece, I always get really quite wary because few people can achieve it, but he really did. He was able to capture, because he believed in metals left polished, not painted, therefore shiny and shimmering. He captured an ephemeral character in the material world, which is extremely difficult to do. He originally started out geometrically, and most of his pieces are like the sun piece, the sunburst piece that was originally in Lincoln Center. It was quite extraordinary because he visualized basically solar phenomena in a piece. He really captured the notion of energy. Tell me when I'm going on too long, because I'm really inspired by this guy. He, and at a time when Sputnik was...
Go ahead.
At a time when Sputnik was happening and the atomic bomb had been detonated 10 years before, he was interested in visualizing energy. It was just kind of the subject of the decade. And he materialized it, he visualized it in these extraordinary installations. this is all difficult to capture, but I think that the Orpheus piece is really a breakthrough for him because he leaves the linear world into a nonlinear world. As I say, pieces like this are quite vulnerable because they're part of a building and they frequently encounter all the bumps that a building goes through in its lifespan. But I went to the people who were running the Lincoln said that times change and tastes change, attention spans change. So if you were thinking of making the building more efficient as they are, I would submit it's just like taking the second movement out of the Beethoven's Seventh Symphony because it's a slow symphony and people get bored, and you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't remove this piece from an integral work of art because it's really part of the building. It's like taking the columns out. It's conceptually just necessary. So
And it's,
that's what I have to say.
Absolutely, Richard Lippold designed Orpheus and Apollo with Max Abramovich and the architects. In fact, when I went to his house in 2002, there were 3 models of Lincoln Center with the pieces in place. That's a whole other question, what happened to his archive and why isn't he more famous today? That could be for another symposium. But yes, but
I just want to put a couple words to that because
yeah.
the classical building is static. It's a classical temple, basically, and he introduces the dynamic, basically. So he's introducing all the sculpture that were in the tipum of the Parthenon. That's what he did there.
Right. And he actually described the works as explosions there, but also relating very much to music. And he wrote about that. And he was very involved with music himself. In fact, he even built an organ, piece by piece, and he played the organ and he played the piano beautifully and other instruments. He was probably a genius, a quiet man, but a genius. So it's very sad that he's so disrespected today. But Miani, you also, do we have time, Sean, for Miani to say a few words about?
Maybe one more question and move on.
And maybe Phyllis too, how Richard Lippold's work fit into the context, into the canon, into what else was happening mid-20th century. And can you start with that, Miani?
Well, I think that he was, it's interesting because in the Calvin Tompkins article, he describes Richard as a loner in terms of the aesthetics that he was pursuing. And I think that if anything, he was really not that interested in the art world itself. He lived more in music. One of his closest friends was John Cage. He was very close to Ray Johnson, but they, Ray Johnson was into his own thing, obviously, of this correspondence art. And I think that Richard didn't look over his shoulder into the art world. He wanted to make things that would move the human spirit, that would be physically, yes, outer space was his thing in terms of being a child of the space age. I think the physical space of the forms that he was making, he wanted to have be extremely resonant with what I would call his inner space or the inner space of the viewer. Right. And those subjects were not particularly popular at the time. In terms of somebody looking inward anyway.
Yes.
He's the opposite of an abstract expressionist.
Yeah. And Phyllis, any comments about how you see his work fitting into?
Well, one thing I do want to read, which I haven't read, is just his expression about how he worked. Giovanni, Joe. Well, we'll get that straight. Joseph Giovanni said that it was mathematical. And this is a wonderful thing he said. The divisions, the spaces between each rod is in perfect proportion to the room itself. Mm-hmm. The large sculpture occupies 1/4 of the space and half of the height. So it is actually in proportion 1/8 of the volume of that room. Well, of course, that's also a way a musician would describe the intervals and such things. Right. It was very interesting. Well, at that time, there was a great deal of discussion about art and sculpture and painting, but mostly sculpture and building. And, it was sort of said, we even said about the Seagram building, that the building itself was a sculpture.
Right.
But it was not favored very much. And I think that just, not just in that time, but I think that in general, there's been always a very difficult connection between art that is site specific and put into a building as art. It becomes part of the building in some sort of a way, but not really respected.
No.
And it is not self-studying. And I think it's a great, great pity. I mean, think of the Renaissance. Think of Michelangelo's tombs. Those great, just
Right.
all of it. And so it's a very false way of looking at things.
Yes, in a way, Richard Lippold was working as an artist, but he was also, his father was an engineer, and he went to the Chicago Art Institute's program that also was associated with engineering. So, but Miani, just very quickly, why do you think Richard is not so well known today, and why do you think Lincoln, the staff at Geffen Hall, thought it was okay and thought they could bring these pieces down, well, not restore them, bring them down, and perhaps get away with nobody paying attention? Why do you think?
I can't speak to their motivations. I'm not sure, but I think that there's a big misunderstanding of how closely artists and architects were working together during that period, and that the architects later on tended more to think of art as a sort of an auxiliary, whereas as far as Richard was concerned, he was really working with the architect, and the two things were inseparable. And I think that's why his career veered in the direction of commissions so much, because he listened. He wanted to make the space really sing. And he did lots of churches. He did spaces that were really, that had a kind of a meaning.
Right.
And why they would decide that this was not part of it, particularly given the musical aspect, not only of this piece, but also of Richard's entire career. It fits perfectly in a philharmonic space.
Right, and the importance of the architect. His works are around the country, and I don't time here to list them, but everybody can go on the web and look that up.